What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. As well as our second channel sponsor, the Hobby Horse in Taylorville, Illinois. If you're ever in town, be sure to stop in and say hi to Martin. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we've got another game coming at you that we filmed down at the Hobby Horse, featuring one of the greatest backstabbings ever caught on film. This week's matchup features Martin playing the unedited Growing Threat Precon deck being led by Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos, Foil playing his favorite Rakdos Comedic Genius Blim, Foggrow playing his NYAM Spellslinger deck being led by Rith, Liberated Primeval, and Patrick returning playing the always toxic Toxrill the Corrosive. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Patrick plays a tapped Dismal Backwater, gaining a life. Martin plays a tapped Temple of Silence, scrying a card, while Foil plays a Swamp for turn and Martin keeps a card on top of his library. Fog just plays a Forest and passes. Patrick plays an Island for turn and also passes. Martin plays a Plains for turn while Foil plays a Mountain, paying 2 to cast a Wishclaw Talisman. Fog plays his own Mountain and then casts a Rampant Growth in order to go get a Plains from his library to put into play tapped. Patrick draws and plays a Drowned Catacomb before passing his turn to Martin, who plays a Spire of Industry while Foil cuts Fog's deck. Martin then pays 2 in order to cast a Mind Stone, while Foil plays a tapped Dross Forge Bridge before paying 1 to cast a Fancy Dark Ritual. This then allows him to cast his commander Blim before he passes turn. Fog plays a Mountain for turn and then pays 4 to cast a Mana Form Hellkite, which then gets countered by Patrick with a Hydro Blast. Patrick plays a Swamp for turn and then pays 2 to cast a Foretell card face down. Martin plays a Swamp for turn and then taps out to cast Path of the Schemer. Each player then mills the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard, which allows him to bring Fog's Mana Form Hellkite back into play on his side of the board. Foil plays a Mountain for turn and then pays to use his Talisman to go get a card from his library, while he then gives the Talisman to Fog. He then casts his Sol Ring that he tutored for before paying 2 in order to cast a Silent Arbiter. Foil then goes to combat, swinging his commander Patrick for 4 damage, which gives him the Silent Arbiter, and then has both Fog and Patrick losing an additional life and discarding a card. Fog plays another Forest for turn before paying 5 to cast Ganix, Astral Hunter. Ganix then enters the battlefield and creates him a treasure token. Fog then sacks the treasure in order to use the talisman that Foil gave him before he then passes the talisman over to Patrick. Patrick draws for turn and then pays 3 for a Gravelighter, which then has each player sacking a creature as it enters play. He then goes to combat, swinging the Arbiter at Martin for 1 damage and passes. Martin plays a Plains for turn and then pays enough in order to cast his commander Brimaz, Blight of Oreskos. Foil draws for turn and then pays enough to recast his commander a second time. Fog plays another Forest for turn before paying 5 in order to cast his commander Rith. Patrick then decides to keep picking on Fog and counters it with a Blue Elemental Blast. Patrick draws for turn and then pays 4 to cast a Solemn Simulacrum in order to go get a land from his library while he passes his turn to Martin. Martin then draws for turn while Patrick puts to play a tapped Swamp. Martin then pays 5 and casts a Shattered Angel, which triggers his commander, creating an Incubator token with 5 counters on it. Foil draws for turn and then pays 2 to cast an Infernal Grasp, targeting the Angel. The Angel then goes to the graveyard and Foil loses 2 life. Foil then pays in order to cast a Phyrexian Negator before going to combat, swinging his commander at Martin for 4 damage. He then gives Martin the Phyrexian Negator, which then has each of Foil's opponents losing additional life and discarding cards. Fog plays another Mountain for turn before then tapping out in order to cast his commander Rith a second time, which finally resolves. Patrick draws for turn and then pays to cast Narset Party of Veils. He then looks at the top 4 cards of his library before revealing a non-creature, non-land card. Patrick then pays to use the Talisman in order to go look for a card in his library before giving the Talisman to Martin. Martin draws for turn and then pays 2 to transform his Incubator token. Martin then goes to combat, swinging his Incubator token at Foil for 6 damage. Second main, he pays to cast Excise the Imperfect on Foil's Negator in order to exile it, which then creates him a second Incubator token with 3 counters on it. Martin then pays to use the Wishclaw Talisman, giving it back to Fog. Foil plays a tapped Bloodfell Caves to turn, gaining a life. He then pays to cast a Demonic Pact and then a Jinxed Idol. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander Martin once again, giving him the Jinxed Idol. This then triggers his commander, once again having his opponents lose life and discard cards. Fogg plays a Plains Return before casting an Intangible Virtue. He then goes to combat, swinging Rith in the air at Narset for 6 damage. With excess damage being dealt to Narset, this then creates Fogg a 5/5 Dragon token on his end step. Patrick draws for turn and then pays to foretell a second card. He then casts a Meathook Massacre where X is equal to 0 and passes. Martin draws for turn and then casts a Phyrexian Delver, which creates him a 3rd Incubator token with 5 counters on it before he returns a Shattered Angel to play from his graveyard, losing 5 life. He then goes to combat and swings a 6/6 Phyrexian token foil for 6 more damage. On his upkeep, Foil chooses to deal 4 damage to the Angel while he gains 4 life. In response to this, Martin sacks the Angel to the Jinxed Idol in order to give the idol over to Patrick. Foil then casts a Steel Golem before going to combat, swinging his commander Martin once again. In response to this, Patrick sacks a Solemn to the Idol to give Martin the Jinxed Idol back while he draws a card. Martin then takes the 4 damage and Foil gives him the Steel Golem. Before Blim's second ability, Martin sacks the Steel Golem to the Jinxed Idol to give it back to Patrick. And then each of Foil's opponents lose extra life and discard cards. Fogg plays a Battlefield Forge for turn before casting a Kicked Inscription of Abundance, choosing all 3 modes. He then puts 2 counters on his commander before then gaining 7 life and choosing to have his commander fight the Silent Arbiter. But in response, Patrick sacks the Arbiter to the Jinxed Idol in order to give it to Fogg. Fogg then goes to combat, swinging his Dragon token at Patrick in the air while he swings his commander at Foil for 7 damage. Fogg then passes his turn, mistakenly creating another Dragon token on his end step. Patrick draws and casts a Demonic Tutor to go get a card from his library before he realizes each of his opponents should have lost a life from the Meathook Massacre. We then all realize, since the Arbiter got sacked in response to the fight trigger, that Fogg actually shouldn't have a second Dragon token. Patrick then pays 2 and casts a Slaughter Specialist, which gets each of its opponents a 1/1 human token. He then pays an additional 1 to foretell his Raven form in order to destroy Martin's Phyrexian token, which he then replaces with a Bird token and passes turn. Martin draws for turn and then pays to cast his own Soul Ring. He then pays to cast a Meteor Golem, creating another Incubation token while he destroys Fogg's Intangible Virtue. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander at Foil while he swings his Delver at Patrick. Foil then chooses to block with his human token while Patrick chooses to take his damage. This then adds a counter to his specialist and gains him a life while Foil draws for turn. Foil then plays a Swamp for turn before casting a Treacherous Blessing, drawing 3 cards, and casting a Curse of Opulence, cursing Fogg. He then goes to combat, swinging Blim in the air at Patrick for 4 more damage, and uses his ability to target his Treacherous Blessing in order to put it into his graveyard. Foil then casts a Master of the Feast and passes turn. Fogg draws for turn and then pays to cast a Scaled Nurturer. He then goes to combat, swinging both of his dragons in the air at Foil. Foil then chooses to block the token with his Master of Feast while he takes 7 more commander damage. This then gains Patrick more life and adds more counters to his specialist. Patrick draws for turn and then decides to pass. Martin draws for turn and then pays to transform one of his tokens into a Phyrexian before he then decides to pay in order to transform his other 2 tokens as well. He then goes to combat and decides to swing all out at Fogg, who just takes all the damage, going down to 17 life. On his upkeep, Foil draws for turn where each of his opponents also draw a card off the Master of Feast. He then plays a tapped Sulphurous Maya for turn before casting a Bedevil in order to destroy Martin's 1 flying blocker. He then goes to combat, swinging his commander at Martin, who responds by exiling him with a Swords to Plowshares. Foil then gains 4 life and knows he's dead next turn to his Demonic Pact, before he then pays 4 to cast a Midnight Oil. On his upkeep, Fogg loses 2 life and then draws for turn. He then plays another Forest for turn before paying to cast a Green Sun's Twilight where X is equal to 5. The rest of the table then tell him to go big or go home, so he decides to tap out the rest of his mana into his Twilight. He then reveals the top 9 cards of his library, which has him putting Rith the Awakener into play for free, while he bottoms the rest of the cards. Fogg then goes to combat, swinging his commander in the air at Foil once again, who's forced to block with his Master of Feast, which then has excess damage being dealt and has him creating another Dragon token on his end step. Patrick then gains a life and adds another counter to his creature. Patrick casts a Demon's Disciple, which has each player sacrificing a creature, which adds more counters to his specialist and has him gaining more life, while each of his opponents each lose a life. He then goes to combat swinging his creature at Fog, who blocks with his Nurturer, which then has Patrick gaining another life and adding another counter to his creature. Martin plays a Karn's Bastion for turn before paying 5 to cast Yawgmoth's Vile Offering. He then uses the offering to destroy Fog's other Rith, while he then puts to play the Maniform Hellkite a second time. Patrick then gains another life and adds a counter to his creature, before Martin goes to combat. Martin then swings his team at both Patrick and Fog, which has Patrick going down to 11 life, while Fog gets taken down to 7. On his upkeep, foils enchantment triggers, which then has him losing the game. Fog draws for turn and then plays an Evolving Wilds. Fog then goes to combat and swings both of his dragons in the air at Martin. In response, Patrick pays to foretell Depart the Realm in order to bounce the Maniform Hellkite back to Fog's hand. Martin then takes his damage, going down to 4 life, before we then get a 4th appearance from Maniform Hellkite this game. Patrick draws for turn, then casts Yahini's Expertise, which wipes the board of most of Martin's creatures. This then allows him to cast a free Spark Harvest from his hand, and he pays the extra 2 to target the Maniform Hellkite, sending it to the graveyard. Patrick then goes to combat in one of the greatest anime betrayals of all time. He decides to attack Fog, taking him out of the game and guaranteeing Martin the win on his next turn. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe in order to see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.